In the shattered remnants of the 7th galactic era, survival is measured not by strength but by connection. On the frozen wastelands of Crivus Prime, a human medic and an alien scientist are thrust together by fate and by the storm that threatens to erase them both. Between the howl of the blizzards and the shadows of ancient horrors, they must forge a bond strong enough to defy extinction. Some connections are born from chance, others from the desperate need to survive. Human laughs while snapping his bones back into place, horrifying the alien girl. The first thing Kalen Voss registered was the taste of blood in his mouth and the distinct sensation of his left arm being somewhere it definitely shouldn't be. The emergency lighting cast the emergency skiff's cabin in a dim red glow, sparks occasionally dancing from torn panels overhead. He ran his tongue along his teeth, all present good. The blood was just from biting his cheek during impact. "Hello! Are you conscious?" A feminine voice called out musical despite its concern. "Please remain still if you can hear me. You have sustained severe injuries." Kalen turned his head toward the voice, grimacing as the movement sent fresh waves of pain through his body. Through blurry vision, he made out a graceful figure with striped fur crouched nearby. As his focus sharpened, he found himself staring into deep blue eyes that seemed to glow in the emergency lighting. "I'm conscious," he managed, voice rough. Dr. Snooks Wright, the xenobiologist. He remembered her from the pre-exposition briefing, though they hadn't formally met. Her black-tipped ears flicked forward at his recognition. "Yes, Aris Snooks," she confirmed, moving closer with careful precision. Her tail swished anxiously behind her as she assessed his condition. "Your injuries are extensive. Your left arm appears dislocated, and I can see at least 2 compound fractures in your right leg. How are you even still conscious?" Kalen couldn't help but chuckle, immediately regretting it as pain lanced through his ribs. "Pretty sure those ribs are broken too, but I've had worse." He used his good arm to push himself into a more upright position, ignoring Eris's startled protest. "I need to set these brakes before the swelling gets too bad. Could you help me get to the nano recovery module? You want to treat these injuries yourself?" Her fur rippled with what he assumed was dismay, the black stripes seeming to writhe in the dim light. "That's not possible. We must wait for rescue. Rescue could be days away in this cryo-tempest," Kalen said, already examining his dislocated arm with clinical detachment. "And I'm a medic. This is literally my job." He flashed her what he hoped was a reassuring smile. "Though I usually work on other people." Eris's ears lay flat against her head as she watched him probe the injury. "Your species can perform medical procedures on themselves while conscious." "When we have to," Kalen gestured to a red case mounted on the far wall. "Could you grab that for me? I'm going to need to set this arm first." She retrieved the nano recovery module with trembling hands. Her tail now puffed out to twice its normal size. "I don't understand. The pain should be, you shouldn't be able to." "Oh, it hurts like hell," Kalen assured her, opening the kit one-handed and quickly locating what he needed. "But pain is just information right now. It's telling me exactly what needs fixing." He laid out supplies with practiced efficiency. "Fair warning. This next part might be a bit disturbing." Before Eris could respond, Kalen braced himself and smoothly popped his shoulder back into its socket with a sickening crack. He let out a shaky laugh, partly from relief and partly from the look of absolute horror on Eris's vulpine features. "There's one problem solved," he said, rolling the shoulder carefully. "Now for the compound fractures. These are going to be trickier." He began cutting away his pant leg to better access the injuries. "Don't suppose you have any medical training." Eris's fur had taken on a distinctly ruffled appearance, but she moved closer, seemingly drawn by a mixture of scientific curiosity and morbid fascination. I have extensive knowledge of xenobiology, but my species does not. We cannot." "Perfect. I could use an extra set of hands," Kalen said, already preparing a local anesthetic. "Don't worry. I'll talk you through it. Think of it as a crash course in human emergency medicine." He paused, then grinned despite the pain. "Crash course, probably poor choice of words given our situation." The look Eris gave him was a complex mixture of disbelief, concern, and growing interest. Her tail swished in what Kaylin was beginning to recognize as agitation, but her scientific curiosity seemed to be winning out over her instinctive horror. She moved to help her fur gradually settling as she focused on the task at hand. "I must admit," she said, following his instructions to help stabilize the first break, "I have never encountered a species quite like yours." Kaylin met her bright blue gaze, noting the way her black-tipped ears now tilted forward with fascination rather than fear. "Well, Dr. Saila, I have a feeling we're both going to learn a lot about each other before this is over." He gritted his teeth as he prepared to set the first break. "Now let me show you how humans handle emergency field medicine." The next few hours passed in a blur of medical procedures and increasingly creative swearing. Iris proved to be a quick study, her initial horror giving way to methodical assistance as Kaylin talked her through each step. Her hands remained steady, even when her fur stood on end, betraying her continued unease with the situation. Splint, Kaylin announced, securing the final bandage around his leg. "Not my prettiest work, but it'll hold." He leaned back against the emergency skiff wall, exhaustion finally catching up with him now that the immediate medical crisis was handled. "Your ability to remain conscious through all of that is remarkable," Eris said, her tail swishing in what Kaylin was beginning to recognize as scientific interest. She was organizing the remaining medical supplies with precise movements, her blue eyes frequently darting to monitor his condition. Humans are pretty sturdy. Kaylin checked his handiwork one last time, though I wouldn't recommend testing that theory further by crashing any more emergency skiffs. A sudden gust of wind rattled the damaged hull, drawing both their attention to the viewport. The cryo-tempest outside had intensified sheets of snow, reducing visibility to zero. The temperature in the cabin was dropping steadily. "We need to assess our situation," Eris said, her fur rippling slightly as another blast of cold air found its way through the hull breach. "The quantum distress node is damaged, and my initial readings suggest temperatures will continue to drop." Kaylin nodded, already doing mental calculations. "What's your species' tolerance for cold?" "Lower than optimal human range," she admitted. "My fur provides some protection, but we evolved on a warmer world." She hesitated, then added, "Your injuries will make you more susceptible to hypothermia. Then we need to consolidate our resources and generate some heat." Kaylin attempted to stand, immediately regretting it as pain shot through his splinted leg. Eris moved with surprising speed, catching him before he could fall. The contact brought them face to face, close enough that Kaylin could feel the warmth of her fur against his skin. Her blue eyes widened slightly, ears twitching forward. For a moment, neither moved. "Your heart rate has increased," Eris observed softly, her scientific detachment slipping. "Is it the pain?" "Among other things," Kaylin replied, allowing himself to lean on her as they made their way to a more sheltered section of the cabin. Her fur was incredibly soft against his arm, and he couldn't help noticing the elegant way she moved even while supporting his weight. They spent the next hour creating a makeshift shelter within the emergency skiff using emergency blankets and salvaged insulation to create a smaller space that would be easier to heat. Kaylin directed the construction, while Eris did most of the physical work, her strength surprising him, despite her graceful frame. "The temperature is still dropping," Iris reported, checking a small device on her wrist. Her fur had begun to puff out against the cold, making her appear slightly larger. "We should combine our thermal blankets and share body heat." Kaylin looked up from his inventory of their supplies, catching a slight ripple through her fur that suggested embarrassment. "Worried about cuddling with a broken human?" "I am worried about your injuries." "Yes," she replied, though her twitching tail suggested there was more to her hesitation. "My species does not typically engage in such close physical contact outside of—" She trailed off her fur, taking on a distinctly ruffled appearance. "Consider it a cultural exchange in the name of survival," Kaylin suggested, trying to keep his tone light despite the growing cold. "Besides, you've already had your hands all over me while we were setting those breaks." Iris's ears flicked back, but she moved to help him arrange their sleeping space. "Your persistence in making jokes despite your condition is also remarkable." "It's a human thing," Kaylin said, carefully settling onto the makeshift bed. Humor helps us cope with stress, among other things. Eris hesitated only briefly before lying down beside him, her warm fur pressing against his side. "Your species continues to fascinate me," she murmured carefully, arranging herself to avoid his injuries. "Perhaps you could tell me more while we wait out the cryo-tempest." "I'd like that," Kaylin replied, acutely aware of her presence against him. "Though I have to warn you, human biology isn't even our most interesting feature." Her tail curled around them both as she pulled the thermal blankets closer. Somehow, I am beginning to believe that she said, her voice carrying a warmth that had nothing to do with their shared body heat. The cryo-tempest raged outside, but in their small shelter, a different kind of warmth was beginning to grow. Kaylin woke to the sensation of gentle fingers probing his splinted leg. Opening his eyes, he found Eris examining his injuries with professional focus, her tail swaying in concentration. The emergency lighting caught her fur in a way that made the black stripes seem to flow like liquid shadow. "Finding anything interesting?" he asked, voice still rough from sleep. Her ears flicked forward at his voice, but she didn't look up from her examination. "The rate of tissue repair is remarkable. The swelling has already decreased significantly." Her fingers moved to check his pulse, though your temperature is slightly elevated, probably fighting off a mild infection, nothing the antibiotics can't handle. He reached for the nano-recovery module, but Eris was faster retrieving it with fluid grace. "Allow me," she said, selecting the correct medications with surprising confidence. "I spent several hours studying your medical supplies while you slept. Your biological resilience is fascinating, but we shouldn't test its limits unnecessarily." Kaylin accepted the medications, noting how her fur rippled with satisfaction when he didn't argue. "Quick study, though. I'm not sure memorizing human medical supplies was part of your xenobiology research plan." "Plans change," she replied, a hint of amusement in her musical voice. "Besides, my original research focused on comparative biological adaptation strategies. This is simply a more practical application." Her tail brushed against his arm as she shifted position, and Kaylin noticed her fur briefly stand on end before smoothing. The reaction made him smile. "Speaking of adaptation strategies, how do your people usually handle injuries? You seemed pretty shocked by my field medicine techniques." Eris's ears tilted back slightly, her movements becoming more measured. "It's complicated. My species experiences physical trauma very differently." She began repacking the nano-recovery module with precise movements. "Perhaps we should focus on improving our shelter." "The cryo-tempest shows no signs of abating." "Unnoted," Kaylin said, carefully testing his range of motion. "But you're right about the shelter. These emergency repairs won't hold if the wind gets any stronger." Working together, they began reinforcing their position. Kaylin directed from his seated position, putting his emergency response experience to use, while Eris handled the physical labor. He couldn't help admiring the efficient way she moved her fur, catching the dim light as she worked. "You're staring," she observed without turning around her tail, swishing with what might have been amusement. "Professional interest," Kaylin replied. "Your muscle structure must be fascinating from a medical perspective. The way you move suggests a completely different skeletal arrangement than human standard." Now she did turn her blue eyes, meeting his with unexpected intensity. "Is that the only reason you're watching me?" The question hung in the air between them, heavy with unspoken implications. Kaylin held her gaze, noting the way her fur seemed to shimmer with anticipation. "No," he admitted finally. "But I try to maintain some professional distance when I'm bleeding all over my patients." "I'm not your patient," Eris said softly, moving closer. "I'm your attending physician. Remember?" Her ears tilted forward playfully, though her tail betrayed some nervousness in its quick movements. "In that case," Dr. Kaylin said, feeling his pulse quicken as she knelt beside him, "what's your professional opinion on interspecies attraction?" Eris's fur rippled in a way he hadn't seen before, and her blue eyes seemed to darken. "I believe more research is required." Her hand came to rest on his chest just over his heart. "Your pulse is elevated again." "Purely physiological response," Kaylin murmured, reaching up to gently trace one of the black stripes along her cheek. Her fur was impossibly soft under his fingers, and he felt a slight tremor run through her at the contact. A sudden crash from outside broke the moment, both of them jerking back to alertness. Eris was on her feet in an instant, moving to check the viewport. "Something's moving out there?" She reported her fur standing on end. "Large, and I'm picking up irregular heat signatures Kalen grabbed for his nano recovery module, already shifting into emergency response mode. Help me up if we have company. We need to be ready." He caught her concerned glance. "I can handle it. Humans are good at pushing through pain when we need to." "Yes," Aris said, helping him to his feet with careful strength. "I'm beginning to understand that about your species." Her tail curled around his waist, offering extra support among other things. They moved to secure their position, but Kalen didn't miss the way she stayed closer than strictly necessary, or how her fur repeatedly brushed against him in a way that seemed less than accidental. Whatever was out there, they would face it together, and afterwards perhaps they could continue their interrupted research on interspecies attraction. The cryo-tempest hit with devastating force. Wind howled through the emergency skiff's damaged hull, bringing waves of stinging ice particles. Kalen and Eris worked frantically to reinforce their shelter as the temperature plummeted further. The hull breaches widening. Eris reported, her voice barely audible over the wind. Her fur was slicked flat against her body, ears laid back against the noise. "We're losing structural integrity." Kalen struggled to his feet, ignoring the protest from his injured leg. "We need to seal it. There should be emergency patch foam in the maintenance kit." He started toward the storage compartment, but stumbled as the emergency skiff shuddered violently. Aris caught him, her strength evident as she steadied his larger frame. "You're going to re-injure yourself," she said, but her tone was more worried than scolding. Her tail curled around his waist, helping him balance. "Rather than freezing to death," Kalen replied, leaning into her support. "Besides, I trust my doctor." Her blue eyes met his, something unspoken passing between them before she helped him to the storage compartment. Working together, they retrieved the patch foam and began sealing the worst of the breaches. "Your stitches are holding well," Eris observed as they worked. Her professional tone belied by the way her fur repeatedly brushed against him. "Though your temperature is still elevated. Just enjoying the company," Kalen said, managing a grin, despite the pain in his leg. The comment earned him an ear flick, and what he was learning to recognize as an amused tail swish. A particularly violent gust rocked the emergency skiff, sending them both sprawling. Kalen landed hard, barely managing to avoid crushing Eris as she fell with him. They ended up tangled together, her fur pressed against his chest, their faces inches apart. "Are you all right?" she asked, making no immediate move to get up. Her breath was warm against his skin, her blue eyes wide with concern, and something else. "Never better." Kalen replied softly, very aware of every point where their bodies connected. Her fur was incredibly soft even through his clothing, and he could feel her rapid heartbeat matching his own. A massive crack echoed through the cabin, breaking the moment they looked up to see ice forming along the hull's seams, the metal groaning under the pressure. "The temperature's dropping too fast," Eris said, reluctantly pulling away to check her instruments. Her fur was ruffled in a way that had nothing to do with the cold. "The cryo-tempest is drawing heat from the emergency skiff faster than our systems can compensate." Kalen forced himself to focus on the crisis rather than the lingering sensation of her fur against his skin. "We need to move to a more sheltered section. Help me gather the essential supplies." They quickly relocated to the emergency skiff's core, where the hull was most intact. Kalen found himself watching Eris as she worked, admiring the efficient grace of her movements even in crisis. She caught him looking, and her tail did that particular swish he was beginning to associate with pleased embarrassment. Her heart rate is elevated again, she noted, pausing in her work to check his pulse. Her touch lingered longer than strictly necessary. "Are you in pain?" Among other things, Kalen echoed their earlier conversation, catching her hand before she could withdraw it. "Though I'm finding the distraction helpful." Eris's fur rippled in response, the black stripes seeming to flow like liquid shadow in the emergency lighting. Perhaps we should explore these distractions for medical purposes, of course. Of course, Kaylin agreed, reaching up to trace one of her stripes' purely professional research. The cryo-tempest raged outside their shelter, but neither of them was paying much attention to it anymore. Aris's fur was impossibly soft under his fingers, and her blue eyes had taken on a darker, more intense shade. Their faces drew closer, the moment electric with possibility. Then Aris suddenly stiffened her ears, shooting upright, and her fur standing on end. "Something's wrong," she whispered, pulling back slightly. Her tail was now rigid with tension. "I can feel there's something." Before she could finish, an alien scream cut through the cryo-tempest's howl, closer than anything should have been able to get in this weather. Their eyes met in shared understanding. They were no longer alone on this frozen world. The alien scream came again. Closer this time, Aris's ears swiveled toward the sound, her fur bristling as she moved to check the viewport. Kaylin grabbed for the emergency kit, pulling out the survival laser. 3 of them, Aris reported, her voice tight. Heat signatures suggest local apex predators. They're hunting by thermal detection. Her tail was rigid with tension, tracking the unseen threats. "They picked up our body heat through the hull," Kaylin said, checking the laser's charge. "We need to." He broke off as Aris suddenly doubled over her fur, rippling violently. "No!" she gasped, dropping to her knees. Her blue eyes were wide with something beyond physical pain. "I can't, they're dying. So many dying." Kaylin dragged himself to her side, medical training taking over. "What's happening? Talk to me, Aris." He gripped his arm, her claws slightly extending in distress. "My people were connected, a neural network linking all of us. Physical trauma, emotional pain. We experience it collectively." Her fur was rippling in waves, now black stripes seeming to writhe. "The horizon spire, something's attacking it. I can feel them all." Understanding dawned. "That's why you were so horrified by my injuries. Your species doesn't experience pain individually. We share it, distribute it through the network until it's manageable." She shuddered. "But you took all that pain alone, handled it, even joked about it." I couldn't comprehend. A massive impact against the hull interrupted them. Through the viewport, Kaylin caught a glimpse of pale scales and too many teeth. "We need to move now." He tried to help Aris up, but she was still shaking with shared trauma from her distant people. "I can't focus," she whispered. "The pain. Everyone's pain." Kaylin made a quick decision, then focus on me. He cupped her face, forcing her to meet his eyes. "You've been fascinated by how humans handle pain. Here's the secret. We focus channel it, use it." He stroked her fur gently. "You can do the same, focus on here, on now, on us." Aris's eyes locked onto his, her breathing slowly steadying. "How can you be so calm? You're injured. We're in danger, and I'm..." "Honestly, having a beautiful alien doctor worried about me is a pretty good distraction." He managed to grin, rewarded by a slight twitch of her ears. "Besides, humans are good at compartmentalizing. We have to be dealing with pain alone." Another impact rocked the emergency skiff. The predators were trying to break through. "I need you here with me," Kaylin said softly, still stroking her fur. "Not lost in the network. Can you do that? Can you handle pain the human way?" "Just for now." Aris's fur gradually settled under his touch, I think, so it feels strange being so isolated. Her tail curled around his wrist, but not entirely unpleasant. "That's my girl." Kaylin caught himself, but Aris's ears had already perked up at the possessive phrase. "I mean..." "No," she interrupted, her blue eyes suddenly intense. "I like it." She leaned forward, pressing her forehead against his. "Being yours, it feels right, like an anchor against the collective." The moment was shattered by the sound of rending metal. The predators had found a weak point. "Time to move," Kaylin said, but Aris was already helping him up her movements now, sure and focused. "We need to reach the emergency shelter in the cargo bay. Then we'll move together," Aris said firmly, supporting his weight, her tail wrapped around him protectively, the human way. They made their way through the darkened emergency skiff every step a challenge with Kalen's injuries. The predator's cries echoed through the hull, but Eris's fur remains steady now, her attention firmly on their immediate survival. "You're right," she said as they reached the cargo bay door. "Focusing on immediate physical sensations, it helps block the network." Kalen caught the slight hitch in her voice. "Having second thoughts about cutting yourself off?" "No." She met his gaze with startling intensity. "I'm discovering there are some experiences I prefer to keep private." The way she said it, combined with how her fur brushed against him, left little doubt about her meaning. Before Kalen could respond, the hull behind them buckled with a screech of tortured metal. "Save that thought," he said, readying the laser. "We've got company." Eris's answering smile showed just a hint of fang. "Good. I believe I'm ready to try handling danger." The human way her tail tightened around him together. The cargo bay offered better shelter, but the sounds of the predators testing the hull made it clear their respite would be brief. Kalen worked quickly to fortify their position while Eris checked his injuries, her touch lingering in ways that had nothing to do with medical necessity. "The swelling in your leg has increased." She noted her fur rippling with concern. "You've overexerted yourself. Worth it to get us somewhere defensible." Kalen caught her hand as she examined his splint, enjoying how her fur stood slightly on end at the contact. "How are you holding up, still feeling the network?" Eris's ears tilted thoughtfully. "It's different now. Like background noise I can choose to tune out." Her tail curled around his wrist. Focusing on immediate physical sensations helps especially. She trailed off her fur, taking on that particular ripple he was learning to recognize as embarrassment. Especially, he prompted running his thumb along the soft fur of her palm. "Especially touching you," she admitted, meeting his eyes. "It's grounding. The network feels distant when I'm this close to you." Kalen felt his pulse quicken at her words and her ears twitched forward in response. "Your heart rate increased again," she observed, moving closer. "You have that effect on me," he said softly. Her blue eyes seemed to darken as she leaned in her free hand, coming up to trace the line of his jaw. A thunderous impact against the hull shattered the moment. One of the predators had found their new location. "We need to get to the quantum distress node controls," Kalen said, reluctantly pulling back. "If we can boost the signal through the cargo bay array, the interference from the cryo-tempest might be less severe at this elevation." Eris agreed, helping him to his feet. Her fur brushed against him as she supported his weight. "Though I'm beginning to understand why humans find danger exciting." Kalen grinned despite the pain in his leg. "Adrenaline is a hell of a drug, though I suspect you're contributing to my elevated readings more than the danger." Her tail did that particular swish he now recognized as pleased embarrassment. "Perhaps we should conduct more thorough tests of that hypothesis after we survive." "This?" "Of course, Dr. Sayla. Are you suggesting we engage in experimental research?" "Purely professional interest," she said, but her fur rippled in a way that suggested otherwise. "Besides, I need to understand how humans handle physical sensations if I'm going to help treat your injuries." The predators chose that moment to launch a coordinated attack on the hull, the impacts coming from multiple directions. Now Kalen readied the laser while Eris moved to check the structural integrity readings. 3 points of attack, she reported, her ears swiveling to track the sounds. "The hull won't hold much longer." She paused, her fur standing on end. "Kalen, I'm picking up more heat signatures. They've called others to the hunt." "Of course they have," Kalen muttered, checking their supplies because this wasn't interesting enough already. He caught Eris's concerned look. "Don't worry, humans are pretty good at improving bad situations." "Yes," she said, moving back to his side. "I'm beginning to understand that about your species." Her tail wrapped around him protectively, were also rather good at adapting when necessary. The way she said we sent a warmth through Kalen that had nothing to do with their shared body heat. "Together then." "Together," she agreed, her blue eyes intense, "though I believe I prefer handling some things individually now." Her fur brushed against him suggestively. After all, some experiences are better not shared with the collective. A massive crash interrupted them as one section of hull began to buckle. Kalen raised the laser while Iris took up position beside him, her own weapon ready. "Just so we're clear, Kaylin said as they prepared to defend their position. "When we get out of this, I'd very much like to help you explore those individual experiences." Eris's answering smile showed just a hint of fang. "Survive this, and I'll let you conduct all the personal research you want." Her tail tightened around him briefly. "For science, of course." "Of course," Kaylin agreed, grinning as the hull finally gave way. "Now let me show you how humans handle impossible odds." The fight had been brutal but effective. 3 predator carcasses lay smoking from laser fire while the others had retreated into the cryo-tempest. Kaylin sat propped against a cargo container watching Eris pace the perimeter, her movements displaying a new confidence in handling crisis situations. "The cryo-tempest's interference is weakening," she reported, pausing to check her instruments. The emergency lighting caught her fur in waves, making the black stripes seem to flow. "But I'm detecting unusual energy readings from the ridge." Artificial Kaylin asked, wincing as he adjusted his position. The battle had reopened some of his wounds. Eris was at his side instantly, her careful fingers probing the injury. "Let me help you first." "I can handle it," he started, but she silenced him with a look that was equal parts doctor and something more intimate. "You've shown me how humans handle pain alone," she said, her tail brushing his arm. "Now let me show you how my people help each other heal." Before he could respond, she pressed her forehead to his and closed her eyes. A warm sensation spread from the contact point, different from fever or adrenaline. Kaylin felt his pain begin to dull, not gone, but shared. "You're taking some of it," he realized, reaching up to stroke her fur, "through your neural network." The implications of that statement sent a pleasant shiver through him that had nothing to do with their healing connection. "And how did you imagine it, Dr. Sayela?" Her fur rippled in that now familiar way that suggested both embarrassment and interest. "Perhaps we should focus on survival first, though I would be happy to demonstrate later." The promise in her voice made his pulse quicken, which she obviously felt through their connection. Her tail did that particular pleased swish he was growing addicted to. "The energy readings," he said, reluctantly trying to focus on their situation. "You think there might be shelter?" "More than that." She pulled back slightly, though she maintained physical contact. "The pattern suggests advanced technology, possibly an abandoned Horizon Spire." "That's convenient," Kaylin said, letting her help him to his feet. His injuries felt significantly better after their shared healing. "Any idea who built it? The architecture isn't familiar." She admitted, supporting his weight as they gathered supplies. "But if it has communication equipment?" "Worth the risk," he agreed. They moved toward the cargo bay exit, checking their weapons. "Though I have to ask, if we find a bed, will you finally show me what you were imagining for our neural connection?" Eris's fur rippled dramatically, and her tail curled around his waist. "I believe that could be arranged for research purposes, of course." "Of course." Kaylin grinned, enjoying how her fur brushed against him as they walked. "Though I should warn you, humans can be very thorough researchers." "Good," she said, her blue eyes darkening, "because I have many hypotheses I'd like to test." They made their way through the cryo-tempest toward the ridge following Eris's readings. The wind had died down enough to see their destination, a sleek structure half buried in ice, its design unlike anything either of them had encountered. The entrance appears sealed. Eris observed, running her scanner over the massive door. "But the power systems are still active. Can you interface with it, I believe?" "So?" Though she hesitated, ears twitching, "I may need to attempt a neural connection with the system. It could be intense." Kaylin stepped closer, wrapping an arm around her. "I've got you, whatever happens. We handle it together." She leaned into his embrace, her fur soft against his skin. "I'm beginning to understand why humans value individual connections so much. The intensity of feeling things personally. Let's wait until we get that bed," Kaylin murmured against her ear, enjoying how her fur stood on end at his words. Eris turned in his arms, pressing close in a way that had nothing to do with sharing warmth. "You are very distracting when I'm trying to work, Kaylin Voss." "Likewise, Dr. Sayela." He traced one of her stripes, watching her pupils dilate. "Though I seem to remember you wanting to conduct some personal research." "First, the door," she said. firmly though her tail remained curled around him. Then, experimentation. She turned to the control panel, placing her hand on its surface. Her fur began to ripple as she established connection with the alien systems. Kaylin held her steady, providing an anchor as she navigated the unknown technology. The door began to slide open with a grinding of ice, revealing darkened corridors beyond. Kaylin was more focused on how Aris trembled against him, her neural connection clearly taking a toll. "I've got you," he whispered, supporting her as the connection ended together. "Remember together," she agreed, her voice husky. "Though I believe I'm ready for some of that individual attention you promised." The way she looked at him left no doubt about her meaning. Together they stepped into the ancient Echo Vault, each knowing that whatever they found inside, their most interesting discoveries would be about each other. The Echo Vault's corridors hummed with ancient power, emergency lighting flickering to life as they moved deeper inside. Kaylin watched Eris's ears swivel, tracking sounds too faint for human hearing, while her tail remained protectively wrapped around his waist. Unsettling how Kaylin asked, noticing how her fur rippled uneasily. It's like she paused, searching for words, like an echo of consciousness, not alive, but not entirely dormant either. Her blue eyes met his. "The system I connected to earlier, it responded to me in ways that seemed almost aware." Kaylin finished remembering how she had trembled during the connection. Yes, her fur stood slightly on end, and now that we're inside, the sensation is stronger, as if the whole Echo Vault is. She broke off as light suddenly blazed through the corridor, momentarily blinding them. When their vision cleared, the Echo Vault had transformed. Holographic displays flickered to life along the walls, showing streams of alien data. The air filled with a low hum that made Kaylin's teeth ache. "That's not good," he muttered, tightening his grip on the laser. Eris's ears lay flat against her head. "The system is fully activating. It's trying to integrate with any available neural networks." Her fur rippled violently, including mine. "Break the connection," Kaylin said sharply, but she was already shaking her head. "I can't. It's like it's resonating with my species' collective frequency." She gripped his arm claws slightly, extending Kaylin. "I think this place was built to harvest neural energy, to store consciousness itself." The humming intensified, and Eris gasped as her fur began to glow with a faint blue light. Kaylin pulled her close, feeling her tremble against him. "Focus on me," he said urgently, cupping her face like before. "Individual sensation." "Remember, block out the collective. I'm trying," she whispered, pressing into his touch. "But it's so strong I can feel it pulling at my connection to the network." Trying to, her eyes widened in sudden understanding. "Kaylin, your injuries, the way you handle pain individually, maybe that's the key." Before he could ask what she meant, she pressed her forehead to his, establishing their personal neural connection. This time, instead of sharing his pain, she seemed to be drawing on his ability to experience sensation independently. The glow in her fur faded slightly as she focused on their point of contact. "Your mind is like a sanctuary," she murmured, "so beautifully contained individual. Show me how to be separate like you." Kaylin stroked her fur, concentrating on the immediate physical sensations. "Stay with me. Feel this, just this, nothing else matters." Their connection deepened, more intimate than before. Kaylin felt a ghost of the collective consciousness pulling at her, but also felt how she anchored herself to him, using their shared sensations as a shield against the Echo Vault's influence. "It's working," she breathed, her tail curling tighter around him. "But we need to shut this place down before it draws in my entire species through the network. Any ideas how?" "Yes," but her fur rippled with mixed embarrassment and anticipation. "We need to strengthen our personal connection, make it powerful enough to override the Echo Vault's systems." The way she said it, combined with how her body pressed against his, made her meaning clear. "Dr. Sayela, are you suggesting what I think you're suggesting? The most intense individual experiences often involve." Her fur took on that particular ripple he now recognized as desire, intimate neural contact. "And this is purely for scientific purposes?" Kaylin asked, already drawing her closer. "Of course," she replied, but her eyes had darkened to midnight blue. "Though I must admit my research interests have become rather personal." The Echo Vault's hum grew stronger, making them both wince. "We should find somewhere more defensible," Kaylin suggested, trying to focus past the distracting sensation of her fur against his skin. "There's a control center ahead," Iris said, reluctantly pulling back but maintaining physical contact, "though I believe we'll need to conduct our research thoroughly to ensure complete system override. Multiple trials may be necessary." Kaylin agreed, enjoying how her fur stood on end at his words for scientific accuracy. Indeed, her tail stroked along his back as they moved deeper into the Echo Vault. "Though I should warn you, my species can be very intense during neural bonding." "Bring it on." Kaylin grinned, pulling her close for a quick kiss that left her fur practically sparking with electricity. Humans are pretty good at handling intensity. The Echo Vault's systems pulsed around them, but neither was paying much attention anymore. They had a mission to complete a civilization to save and some very personal research to conduct. The fact that all three goals aligned so perfectly just proved that sometimes the universe had a sense of humor and excellent timing. The Echo Vault's control center lay silent, its neural harvesting systems permanently disabled. Kaylin sat with his back against a console. Eris curled against his chest, her fur still occasionally sparking with residual energy from their shared neural experience. "I believe," she said, her voice still husky, "that was the most thorough research I've ever conducted. Multiple trials were necessary." Kaylin replied, stroking her fur and enjoying how she pressed into his touch. "For scientific verification." Of course, her tail curled possessively around his waist, though I may need to classify some of our findings as personally restricted. Before Kaylin could respond, her ears suddenly shot upright. A moment later, he heard it too, the distinctive sound of approaching ships. "Rescue vessels!" Iris confirmed, checking her instruments. Her fur rippled with mixed relief and concern. "My species' design, they must have tracked the disturbance in the collective network." Kaylin tightened his hold on her slightly. "Will there be problems with us? Interspecies relationships aren't uncommon," she said, turning to face him. "But my people have never encountered a species that experiences sensation so individually." Her blue eyes met his. "They may not understand what we've discovered together. Then we'll help them understand." He traced one of her stripes, watching her fur ripple in response. "After all, we just saved your entire species from being absorbed by an ancient neural harvesting system that should earn us some credibility." "True," she admitted, pressing closer, "though I may omit some of the more intimate details of how we accomplished that." The ships were close now, their engines vibrating through the Echo Vault's structure. Eris's ears twitched at the sound, but she made no move to pull away from Kaylin. "There will be questions," she said softly, "about your injuries, about how we survived, about us." Her tail tightened around him. "My people aren't used to such intense individual connections. They may see it as dangerous." "Let them," Kaylin said. "Cupping her face will show them that sometimes the most powerful bonds are formed one-on-one." Eris's fur rippled with pleasure at his words, but her ears remained alert. "The rescue team will include medical personnel. They'll want to examine you to understand how you handle trauma alone. As long as you're my primary physician," he murmured, enjoying how her fur stood on end. "I've grown rather attached to your treatment methods." "Kaylin Voss," she said, her voice dropping to that particular tone that made his pulse quicken. "Are you suggesting we continue our research?" "Definitely." He pulled her into a kiss that left her fur practically glowing. "I think we've barely scratched the surface of possible experiments." The sound of airlock mechanisms engaging echoed through the Echo Vault. Iris reluctantly pulled back, though her tail remained wrapped around him. "Ready to face the collective?" Kaylin asked, helping her to her feet. "With you?" She pressed her forehead briefly to his, sharing a rush of emotion through their now familiar connection. "I'm ready for anything." The rescue team found them standing together, professional, but with Eris's tail curved possessively around Kaylin's waist. The lead medical officer's fur stood on end at the sight of Kaylin's injuries, but Eris stepped forward before they could react. This human, she announced, her voice carrying the authority of her scientific position, has demonstrated remarkable abilities that warrant extensive further study. Her tail stroked along Kaylin's back as she continued, I propose a long-term research partnership to explore these capabilities for the advancement of both our species. Of course, Kaylin agreed, fighting back a grin at how her fur rippled when he rested his hand at the small of her back, purely professional interest. The medical team's confusion was evident in their twitching ears and bristling fur. But Eris's reputation and the evidence of their success in neutralizing the Echo Vault's threat carried weight. As they were escorted to the rescue ships, Eris leaned close to whisper, I hope you're prepared for extensive follow-up studies, Kaylin Voss. Looking forward to it, Dr. Sayila, he murmured back, enjoying how her fur shimmered at his words. After all, proper research requires thorough investigation. Her answering smile showed just a hint of fang indeed, and I have so many hypotheses left to test. 2 weeks later. Kaylin sat in Eris's private medical office aboard the Horizon Spire, watching her fur ripple with barely contained excitement as she reviewed their latest findings. The implications are extraordinary, she said, her tail swishing in that particular way that meant she'd made a breakthrough. Your ability to process trauma individually doesn't just allow you to handle injuries, it creates a unique neural resistance that protected you from the ancient Echo Vault's harvesting systems, and that resistance extended to you through our connection. Kaylin added, enjoying how her ears perked up at the mention of their bond. Yes, she moved closer, her fur brushing against him as she pulled up more data. The combination of human individual consciousness and my species' collective abilities creates something entirely new. Something that could revolutionize how both our peoples handle trauma. Kaylin caught her hand stroking the soft fur of her palm. Is that your professional opinion? Dr. Sayila. Among other opinions, she replied, her blue eyes darkening as she stepped between his legs. Though I believe we need to conduct more personal research to fully understand the phenomenon. More research, he pulled her closer, watching her fur ripple with anticipation. We've already scandalized half your medical staff with our research methods. Only half her tail curled around him possessively. We must be losing our touch. The door chimed, interrupting what promised to be a very interesting demonstration of their research techniques. Eris's ears flicked in annoyance, but she maintained professional distance as the Horizon Spire's chief medical officer entered. The older Zarathi's fur stood slightly on end at finding them so close, but she managed to keep her ears level as she delivered her report. The council has reviewed your findings, she announced, her tail twitching with barely concealed agitation. They've approved the establishment of a permanent human Zarathi medical research program with you two, as joint leads. Eris's fur practically glowed with pleasure, though she maintained her professional tone. Thank you, Chief. We'll ensure the program yields valuable insights for both species. I'm sure you will, the Chief replied dryly, her ears twitching as she noticed how Eris's tail remained curled around Kaylin, though perhaps with slightly more traditional research methods. We go where the science leads us, Kaylin said innocently, enjoying how Eris's fur rippled at his deliberate double meaning. The Chief's ears laid back slightly, but there was a hint of amusement in her expression. Indeed. Well, I'll leave you to your research. She paused at the door. Though you might consider updating the privacy settings on the medical lab's observation windows. Some of our younger staff members have been rather distracted by your experimental methods. After she left, Eris turned to Kaylin with that particular look that meant trouble of the best kind privacy settings. I thought you'd handled those during our last investigation. Must have been too focused on the experiment at hand, he replied, pulling her close again. Though I seem to recall you were rather distracting at the time. Distracting, her fur shimmered as she pressed against him. I was merely being thorough in my observations. Very thorough, he agreed, tracing one of her stripes and watching her pupils dilate, though I think we might need to verify those results again for scientific accuracy. Of course, she reached for the privacy controls without looking, her tail already wrapping around him possessively. We should probably run multiple trials to ensure statistical significance. Dr. Siala Kalin murmured against her ear, enjoying how her fur stood on end. "Are you suggesting we conduct another explosive experiment in neural connectivity?" "Actually," she said, her voice dropping to that tone that never failed to make his pulse race, "I was thinking we might explore some new hypotheses about human-vulpine compatibility." Her claws traced lightly down his chest. "I have several theories that require hands-on investigation." "Lead the way," Dr. Kalin said, already lost in the midnight blue of her eyes. "After all, who am I to stand in the way of scientific progress?" Kalin's answering smile showed just a hint of fang as she initiated their neural connection. As sensation and emotion flowed between them, Kalin reflected that some experiments were worth repeating indefinitely, especially when they yielded such satisfying results. The privacy screens finally engaged, leaving them alone with their research, their discoveries, and each other. And if their methods weren't entirely traditional, well, the best breakthroughs never were.